Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us to this session on working parents, flexibility and job quality. What are the trade-offs? We're going to be discussing a report produced by the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here at King's College, the UAE, with working families funded by the Nuffield Foundation. First of all, we're going to hear from my colleague Rose Cook about the report, with a follow-up from Alex Beer, Head of Welfare Programmes at the Nuffield Foundation. And then we've got a fantastic panel to speak to us all. First of all, we've got Tulip Sadiq, MP for Hampstead and Kilburn, and then Working Families Chief Executive Jane Van Zyl, and Kudzia Batul, Head of Equalities at the TUC. And so with that, we're going to head over to Rose.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rose Cook. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. I want to apologise, I do have a bit of background noise, and I'm really hoping that will end by the time I start my presentation properly. But before I do kick off, I wanted to just hand over briefly to Alex Beer, Head of Welfare at the Nuffield Foundation, who's going to say a few words about why Nuffield's funded this research. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Rose. Yes, so my name's Alex Beer and I'm Welfare Programme Head at the Nuffield Foundation. And we're delighted to be funding this important research being undertaken by Rose, Laura Jones and Sarah Connolly in partnership with Working Families. The Nuffield Foundation's mission is to advance social well-being. We do this by funding research and analysis in the domains of education, welfare and justice to help better understand the issues affecting people's life chances and the trends and the disruptive forces that are changing the structure and context of people's lives. The research that we fund aims to inform social policy by demonstrating how we might address inequalities, discrimination, and vulnerabilities in an increasingly diverse and fragmented society. Juggling work and family life is a common feature of many parents' lives, but the intersections between the two and their implications for individual and family well-being are relatively under-researched. Therefore, as part of the Nuffield Foundation's welfare portfolio, we are particularly keen to support research that increases our understanding of the issues and identify those who might be at greater risk of adverse outcomes. By examining the relationship between job quality and parenthood in the UK, this research promises to make a highly relevant contribution to our shared understanding. I really look forward to the discussion of today's report about the aspects of job quality that are important to parents, a topic on which many of us have both personal and professional interest, as well as looking forward to future research outputs from the project, which will examine how job quality changes over the life course and how job quality penalties, bonuses and trade-offs are distributed between different groups of mothers and fathers. Back to you, Rose.
Thanks so much, Alex. So I'm going to share my presentation slides now. Hang on a second. Sorry. Okay, can everybody see those? Yep, brilliant. Okay. Right, so for a bit of background to the research, now I'm going to go through the background and methodology fairly quickly because I'm really keen to get onto the findings as soon as possible in the time that we have available. So yes, this report that we're going to be talking about today is part of a larger mixed methods project, which is called Who Can Have It All? Job Quality and Parenthood in the UK. So the reason why we wanted to focus on job quality is really to maintain a focus on working conditions and people's experiences of work alongside the big focus on employment that we do have in the policy at the moment. When it comes to working parents, the conversation is often very focused on flexible working as being the key thing. But job quality is far more holistic than that. And so we wanted to focus on the lots of different aspects of job quality in addition to flexible working. really sorry for the noise if it's bothering anyone. I'm hoping that it will stop soon and that you can hear me okay nonetheless. And then finally, we're really interested in this kind of gender dimension of parenthood and job quality. So we know that there's a motherhood penalty, of course, when it comes to pay, and that this is one of the major drivers of the gender pay gap. But we were really interested to find out, does this apply to other aspects of job quality as well? Is there a motherhood penalty, or how are those job quality dimensions sort of divided between men and women and mothers and fathers in that transition to parenthood? So briefly, what is job quality? It comprises lots of different elements, mainly relating to whether a job is decent, whether it's fair and conducive to workers' well-being. And it can also be about whether the job's fulfilling and meaningful as well. So some of these aspects that I've got on the slide here relate to kind of working conditions, including contract type and working hours and things like that, as well as the other resources that a job provides to workers, such as pay, security, benefits, opportunities to progress and autonomy. So some elements of job quality can be improved via kind of softer interventions, whereas others require more regulation and policy change. And job quality is especially relevant in the current moment, where I think workers are expecting and demanding a lot more from employers in terms of their working conditions and kind of moving on if those aren't met sometimes. So in terms of our research questions, we were interested in what aspects of job quality were important to parents, what trade-offs and compromises parents are making, how flexibility interacts with other aspects of job quality, and also the pandemic context, so how that's changed what parents want from work. So just briefly on the methods, the findings that I'm going to talk about today are based on focus groups that we conducted during the summer, so qualitative research. This is a sort of profile of participants that we spoke to. We tried to get a varied sample of parents working in different kinds of jobs, living in different parts of the UK with different family situations, and also a split between mothers and fathers. So a brief overview of our findings to start with. So the first point that I'm going to talk about, flexibility is key, but often narrowly defined and poorly implemented. Looking beyond flexibility, job security and control are also very important. Women are making significant involuntary job quality trade-offs. So I'll explain what I mean about that more later on. And in the post-pandemic context, parents want to see a broader approach to flexibility. They want to be trusted more and have greater recognition of their concerns and more of a voice in the workplace. So to start off with flexibility, the majority of both mothers and fathers that we spoke to mentioned flexibility as a central aspect of job quality for them. Most who already had flexibility really valued it a lot, and those who didn't have it were keen to get it in the future. However, there was a sense that flexibility is not always working well for people, and there are some barriers to achieving full, authentic flexibility. Firstly, employers don't always offer the kinds of flexible options that parents actually need. Though there's certainly more openness around working from home, nowadays, other types of flexibility are less often considered or offered to employees. And this is particularly the case in the types of jobs where working from home isn't possible. It's then assumed that other types of flexibility aren't possible either. Yet we know there are many possibilities that can be workable in a range of fields, including split schedules, job shares, compressed hours, reduced hours, etc. So, for example, two mothers that we spoke to didn't want to cut their hours, but they did want flexible schedules. But yet this is something that seemed impossible in their workplace. One said, "I don't mind the volume of work, but I need it to be on my terms so that I can fit things around it." Another said, I'm more than happy to work at night once the kids are in bed, and that's been tried and tested. To do that without dropping down to 0.7 or 0.8, because I don't see that there is a need for me to cut my hours in that way. Participants also talked about unsupportive culture around flexible working and fearing negative reactions to making requests. Employers often talked about the business needs in order to deny flexible working requests without considering them properly. And people spoke about gendered assumptions that they'd experienced. For example, the assumption that a mother would automatically want to work part-time, or that they would automatically prioritize their career less after having children, as well as for fathers that they would not want or need flexible working. For example, one father described asking to leave early to collect his child from school, and the response from his employer was, also he said, when I asked for support from my manager, they were like, why? Where do you need to go? Why do you need time off? What's your priority? Can your wife not pick up the children from school? There was also a lack of knowledge about how to deal with requests. For example, one mother working in technology told us, when I requested it, they didn't know what to do. Despite there being a policy, they didn't know who needed to sign it off, who was allowed to sign it off. It was a 3-month process because nobody had seen it before, despite my place of work being a massive global company. Another thing some people spoke about was unchanged expectations when working flexibly. So yes, they can be flexible, but the deadlines and the pressure is still there and doesn't change. All of these barriers mean that genuinely workable flexibility is currently out of reach for many of the parents that we spoke to. So while parents valued flexibility really highly, there were also other aspects of job quality that came through strongly in our focus groups as really important. And I want to talk today about job security and control, which are rarely mentioned in discussions about family friendliness in the workplace. So for some, job security is focused on the need to have a permanent employment contract. For example, one father told us, I think for me, when I think about my career and going into parenting, I had a lot of freedom in my work where I could move around, work in different countries, all that kind of stuff. But that had to stop as soon as I had my children. My first thought when we had children was I needed to have some kind of permanence. However, security doesn't only mean permanent contracts. Security can come from the sense of predictability, for example, in your shift patterns or your hours. During the focus groups, we discussed some hypothetical jobs and tried to get parents' reactions to them. So those which included self-employment or non-permanent contracts were generally perceived less favourably, even if they had other benefits. So, for example, a job that would involve self-employment, but with a large amount of flexibility, provoked negative reactions as it was seen as lacking security and not being family friendly enough for that reason. For parents that we spoke to, a sense of control over tasks, schedules, and boundaries was vital, especially in the context of rigid childcare and school hours. Both mothers and fathers described being less able to respond to unpredictable demands and last-minute demands since they had children. Our findings underscore the argument that, to be genuinely family-friendly, jobs have to offer not only things like flexible working, but also things that support families' well-being, like security and control. Why can't we have both? Our research shows that working parents sometimes make painful sacrifices to secure some elements of job quality. These trade-offs are mainly done by mothers, and in most cases, they're unwanted. So this goes against the narrative that women willingly make sacrifices to secure the flexibility they want at work. Many feel forced into these trade-offs and are not happy about them at all. There's no obvious reason why these trade-offs have to be made, and they're extremely damaging for gender equality. The most common trade-off was to sacrifice pay, career progression, or things like learning on the job or access to training in order to gain flexible working. So for some, their pay had fallen because they'd shifted from a higher paid job into a job where flexibility was openly available, but which was also lower paid. Several participants recognized that with their skills and experience, they could earn more in another job, but they were unwilling to give up their flexible working arrangements, and so were in a sense trapped. For some parents, a job change to achieve flexible working had also entailed moving to a job that they were overqualified for or with fewer prospects. Some of the parents we spoke to had made the radical downward shifts like this shortly after becoming parents, because they didn't have the option to maintain their career whilst working flexibly. One mother told us, "I actually gave up my career to go part-time and to change jobs. When my son was born, I just couldn't go back full-time. So I got a part-time job, and it's not my career, but it pays the bills." Importantly, mothers are not only sacrificing pay and progression, but also the fulfillment of having a career that they love. This woman spoke of desperately missing her career and the sense of accomplishment that it gave her. And the only reason she was missing this is because it was not possible for her to work the full-time standard hours. Interestingly, these patterns are really similar to what we're finding in our quantitative research that we're doing with nationally representative data, where mothers seem to do well on flexibility, but poorly on some other indicators of job quality, probably due to these sorts of trade-offs taking place. Men that we spoke to were far more likely to speak of trade-offs in a positive light, so as something they'd done for the benefit of the family. For example, one dad said, "I know I've come to sacrifice some stuff, but I've not found it as a negative. I want to look back in 20 years and think I've been there for the kids right through." So moving on to the pandemic experience, parents that we spoke to had a lot of different experiences of work during the pandemic, including being furloughed, working from home, starting a new career, and working as key workers. But based on these variety of experiences, most parents wanted to see lasting change to improve their working lives. So parents wanted to see more creative thinking around flexible working, so going beyond just working from home. For instance, increased openness to alternative schedules and to ensuring a gender inclusive approach, so supporting fathers to work flexibly as well. Parents want to see employers attach greater value to what they do rather than how many hours they work. They also want their views, needs, and opinions to be taken into account and to have more voice and recognition at work. Okay, almost done. Just to the recommendations now. So obviously the problems that we've highlighted need cultural and structural solutions, and there are no easy answers. However, we do have some recommendations, and we're also really interested in hearing from the audience, particularly employers, about positive initiatives and examples that can really improve working life for parents by reducing the need for trade-offs or otherwise. And really interested to hear your feedback on the research and on the recommendations as well. So if you do have any examples that you want to highlight, you could post those in the Q&A function. So starting with recommendations for employers, we think that employers should take the issues faced by working parents really seriously, or risk losing them in the current labour market where, there's talk of the Great Resignation. So we think the day one right to request flexibility that's being proposed is really positive, but we also think that the range of flexible working options available needs to be made available at all levels of seniority and all types of jobs within organisations. We also think employers should ask parents what they need in terms of flexibility or other changes to their jobs to improve the working conditions and improve the request process. We think that the job quality trade-offs that we've highlighted could be perhaps alleviated by offering workable flexibility at all levels of organisations, as I've said, and also by monitoring the career progress of those who do work flexibly and offering them more training and learning opportunities to ensure that they don't get stuck. And also including job security and control as criteria when thinking about if your organisation is family friendly. In terms of recommendations for policymakers, we think the day one right to flexibility is a great idea, but we also think that there needs to be better guidance to employers in terms of how to deal with flexible working requests and a focus on employment rights maintained. We think that in the current focus on employment, there should be a maintained focus on job quality, especially for groups like working parents who seem to be at high risk of job quality compromises. The cost of childcare is really fundamental to, as a sort of background to all of this. We could perhaps talk about that more in the discussion, but it's something that really needs to be addressed as part of the package. And we think as part of addressing gender pay gap and reforms to the reporting process, employers should be required to monitor pay and progression among employees that work flexibly. Okay. So that's all that I had to say for the moment. I'm really happy to answer questions and to receive any feedback and any practical solutions that you might have, as I said. I'd really like to thank the parents who participated for speaking to us about their experiences, and also to Nuffield who funded the research. There's going to be the link to the report will be posted in the chat, so you can read the report in full. I really recommend that you do that. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Rose. And before I hand over to the first panelist, when we come to the general chat, we've had a few questions for you about ethnic diversity in the sample and how you chose your participants and what difference that made. So perhaps you could reflect on that and we will return to it. But first, we're going to hear from Tulip.
Thanks, Rosie, and thanks to everyone at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, the Nuffield Foundation, and Working Families for their work on this really important report and for inviting me to speak here. It's an issue very close to my heart, and some of you will know. Rosie's already said I'm Tulip Sadiq. I'm the Member of Parliament for Hampstead and Kilburn. I'm also the Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years. And maybe most importantly, I'm mother of 2 very small children. So I know firsthand how important flexible working can be. And during the lockdown, when I was working flexibly for the first time from home, from Parliament, it made an enormous difference to the quality of my life, but also to the quality of my children's life as well. I have to say, I'm probably not in the best job if I want to have flexible working, because the extreme flexibility of late night sittings and also how unpredictable votes in the House of Commons can be is probably not something that other employers should strive to emulate. I have tried to raise it over and over again in Parliament, and to be honest, it usually falls on deaf ears. We finally got proxy voting for parents who have children and want to take some sort of leave, but that's as far as we've gone. So watch this space. I am trying my best to try and drag Parliament into the new century. So let's see what happens. But going back to the issue at hand, I wanted to pay a special tribute to the team at Working Families for all the work that they've done on this issue, but also the help that they gave me when earlier this year I brought forward my 10-minute rule bill on flexible working in Parliament. The research and the case studies they provided me were invaluable in making the case for a much wider uptake of flexible working, in particular in showing the huge benefits it has for businesses who've given employees options for genuine flexibility in how they worked, and showing that flexible working is a win-win for workers and employers is key to winning the argument on this. And there's a lot of people I have to convince in Parliament. So all the evidence I have, all the casework and research that I have helps to strengthen my case. The report that's being launched today is no doubt going to make a very important contribution to the debate. And it clearly reinforces the simple point that was the impetus for bringing forward legislation on this, that despite all the positive talk about flexible working that the pandemic has generated, there's still huge barriers to genuine flexibility in the workplace. So while we all know there is currently a right to request flexible working, you can do that. The current rules give employers huge leeway in rejecting requests just by citing something like business needs, which are nothing more than just a pretext for maintaining an outdated and unsupportive workplace culture. I was really pleased that my office manager recently requested to take paternity leave, and he's doing the majority of the paternity leave and taking time off. But one of the reasons was because his partner's workplace weren't as flexible when it came to flexible working after their child is born, which is a real pity. So what from the evidence, as many of you will know, 4 in 5 workers want to work more flexibly, yet a third of flexible working requests are rejected, sadly. And we know from the research by the EHRC that 2 in 5 mothers don't request flexible working because they believe, often rightly, that it'll be rejected or that it'll be viewed negatively by their employer. And we've already heard about how fathers are twice as likely as mothers to fear that asking for flexible working will damage their career, which is a shocking state of affairs at this time in 2021 in our country. And indeed, this report highlights that the flexibility that's on offer in many jobs is one where the terms are dictated by employers, for example, over shift patterns, or if we've seen recently mandated home working. And actually, this may surprise quite a few people, but things have gotten worse recently, despite the general impression among politicians and others that flexible working has flourished as a result of COVID-19. Research by the TUC showed that apart from home working, which obviously skyrocketed during the pandemic, other forms of flexibility have actually decreased. So flexi time, part-time, job shares, compressed hours, which are all forms of flexibility that employees value, are now less common than 2 years ago. So we've actually gone backward on this issue. When I launched my flexible working bill, I pointed out that the organization Pregnant Then Screwed had seen the number of calls about flexible working to its helpline for mothers double in the first year of the pandemic, with 2/3 of requests refused. And we know that fathers' requests for flexible working are refused at almost twice the rate of mothers. So the point is that we can't just sit back doing nothing and hope that natural forces will improve access to flexible working and dispel the negative associations with it that hold employees back. For me personally, one of the most important contributions to the debate that this report makes is its examination of the often negative link between flexible working and the other things that employees want. So for example, pay or career progression. This research shows that as well as flexibility, parents value this progression as well as job security, financial security, and managerial support. But far too often, they're either or in the minds of some employers who have negative views about flexible working arrangements that influence their judgment about other aspects of employees' progression. Sadly, the result is that some parents are forced to take job security and progression over flexibility, while others take flexibility over security and progression. So in the future that we want to build going forward, we shouldn't be having to make these choices, I think. The other point that the research illustrates that I wanted to mention briefly is the fact that the changes we saw during the pandemic have actually made people rethink about how they want to work, and they expect more from their employment now. So there is a strong appetite amongst the public for gender inclusive flexible working and a better, more understanding and more supportive relationship between employers and employees. I wanted to pay tribute to a lot of the businesses in my constituency who are now starting to understand the benefits of offering genuine flexible working and making those opportunities available to their employees. So to be honest, I think now is the time for change, and that the message from this report is clear. We've got to improve access to flexible working, but also make sure that it doesn't come at the expense of job quality, which is dependent on other factors as well, including financial security, pay progression and career development. And the real question, I think, at this point is, how do we achieve that given the serious barriers to this that currently exist? And thankfully, this report has a lot of suggestions, and you'll hear later from the TUC, who are better placed than me to talk about the recommendation that this report makes for employers. But I'll just quickly say that I believe employers should be looking at these suggestions carefully, rethinking how their approach to recruitment, retention, to HR support and business planning is. We also can't just rely on employers if we want to reach a solution where flexible working is widely available. Despite the overwhelming financial benefits to business of doing so, the institutional and attitudinal barriers are too great in many workplaces. So I think we need to have a culture change. We need to have a change in attitude, but we also need the government to act. So I do firmly believe we need to bring in legislation to ensure that maximum amounts of flexibility that is available in any job is advertised and genuinely on offer. On the bill that I presented on flexible working, that was my 10-minute rule bill. It has a second reading this month, and I tried to talk about how we've got to have flexible working advertised in any job that's put on offer, and it needs to be in the government's long-promised employment bill. So I had my second reading this month, and I was very pleased to see that there was cross-party support for my bill. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed and seeing if we can achieve something around that. The other thing in this report that ministers could do right now to improve the situation before we come to the bill, there's lots of things like strengthening guidance for employers on dealing with flexible working requests, or simply working with businesses directly to try and promote flexible working, rather than implying that things like home working are a barrier to progression, as some have done, unfortunately. I also firmly believe government should be incentivizing employers to prioritize job quality for parents and for other workers and carers who have responsibility, and stressing that the trade-off between flexibility and quality should be a thing of the past. The other thing I'll just briefly touch on, because I am Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years, is that this report very rightly highlights the impact of the high cost of childcare on job quality. Childcare affordability and availability is shockingly poor in some parts of our country, and it exacerbates these awful trade-offs around job quality that parents are too often forced to make in the early years of their children's lives. There's a lot more I could say about this report and this topic generally, because I feel very passionately about it, but I'll leave it there for others to speak. I want to just finish by assuring you that there are MPs out there from all parties, not just from my party, who are fighting for genuine flexible working, and we want it to become the default. And I was really encouraged when I put forward my bill. There were so many people from all different parties wanting to support it. And that made me feel heartened, because it's not always the case in Parliament. But I will continue to work across the House of Commons to take this campaign forward and to push for the findings and recommendations of this report to be properly understood by policy makers. And if anyone wants to get in touch with any suggestions ahead of the second reading of my bill, you can email me. It's just tulip@tulipsadiq.com, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Tulip. I think we all want to say, thank you for the important work. Let's win that fight. And so handing over to Jane.
Thanks very much. And Tulip, thanks for your kind words. It's always a pleasure to support anybody who's championing flexible working in all of its forms. Hello, everyone. I'm Jane. I'm the Chief Exec at Working Families. And for those of you who don't know us, we exist to remove the barriers that working parents and carers face in the workplace. And we do this in three ways. We provide free legal advice to working parents and carers to empower them to know and use their employment rights. We support employers to create, build and sustain flexible and family-friendly workplaces. And we use those two views, what we know is possible and what we know is not working, to drive positive policy change. Last year, we had 1.6 million unique views of our advice pages, so our advice is clearly very needed. We provided 3,100 working parents and carers with bespoke advice, and we worked with 160 employer members and therefore impacted more than 650,000 employees' workplaces. And I'm delighted to have had we are delighted to have had the opportunity to collaborate with King's College to address a much overlooked area in the context of family-friendly policy and practice. In the last 18 months, the trade-offs working parents make have been more visible than ever. And this research adds depth to that understanding and insights into the less visible decisions that many working parents take. Job quality means different things to different people at different points in their lives. If we are serious as a society in wanting to improve jobs for all, then this requires building understanding of people's experience of job quality and then supporting employers to listen and respond to their employees' needs. I'm really pleased this report provides practical recommendations for policy change. And with the government's flexible working consultation and, as Tulip mentioned, the promised employment bill, we do have opportunities for real world impact. The research is so valuable for providing deep insights into what parents want and expect from a job and the compromises they have to make in order to meet caring responsibilities. We've seen the results from many surveys, including our own Flex the UK, telling us that parents want to hold on to the flexible working arrangements some of them acquired during the pandemic, but it's good to learn more about what parents truly want. As the report says, it's not just about flexibility, but also about security and control. And I was particularly struck by the example of parents in the report who spoke of the assumptions regarding their ambitions or lack thereof, and their desire to progress in work. And similarly, the number of parents who reported taking on lower paid jobs in which they had greater autonomy over when work was performed. And sadly, it has ever been thus. Evidence from our own legal advice service shows the challenge that parents face as a result of insecure working situations and the need to have control over their schedules to manage caring responsibilities. Flexibility is a key solution. However, it's not the only one. This research is an important reminder for employers to respect and value their employees' lives beyond work and foster supportive environments. Recommendations 9 and 10 of this report call for greater engagement in workload planning. It's really important to ask working parents what they need and value at work and help them to achieve that rather than relying on assumptions when an employee starts working flexibly. Workload needs to be reconfigured in a realistic way, and we would call this creating human-sized jobs. If you're going to be working part-time, you clearly can't be expected to produce exactly the same outcomes as you have previously. And the research highlights the inequalities facing parents, and particularly mothers, in the workplace. They are at risk of making trade-offs that hinder their career progression, job satisfaction, and their well-being. Working families, employer members lead the way in developing family-friendly workplaces. And through our annual employers benchmark, we continue to show that progression is a key area of focus, and activity in this area will be crucial to narrow gender pay gaps. The recommendations also address the fact that employers should monitor part-time and flexible working in relation to employee characteristics, pay, and progression to make it clear if and when part-time and flexible employees are getting stuck. Action in this area will also reduce gender inequality. We've provided some thoughts and recommendations for employers, but it's also important to view this in the wider policy context. We were recently pleased to hear that the new BEIS Director for Employment say at the last Flexible Working Task Force meeting, that's quite a sentence, that job quality had been somewhat neglected, but would be receiving more attention. and we'll be sharing this research from King's College with the members of the task force. As identified in the report, it's really important that government recognise the multifaceted role of flexible working and improving job quality and equalising opportunities. And we like to see this considered as part of the government's Levelling Up white paper and its plans for jobs. We're currently drafting our response to BEIS's flexible working consultation, which sets out proposals for a day one right to request flexible working, to reduce the response time by employers, and to lift the cap of one request a year. The consultation also considers whether employers should show that they've considered alternative flexible arrangements when and if they reject a request. While we would like to see government introduce a requirement for all jobs and for large companies to design and advertise flexibly, we'll be arguing the case for the proposed changes as set out in the consultation as steps towards providing parents and carers with the opportunities to access greater autonomy over their working arrangements. Beyond our work on the task force and input into the consultation, we'll take the findings from this report to shape our future work in three ways. Working with our network of employer members across a range of sectors, some of whom are new to this debate. Secondly, to inform our co-creation work with our academic advisory panel and our families and work group, particularly as they scope out new research and policy influencing opportunities. And finally, we will continue to listen to parents and understand what they need and want in a job as we move beyond the pandemic through our Parents and Carers Advisory Panel. A huge thanks, of course, to Rose Cook and the team, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College, the Nuffield Trust, the UEA, and at Working Families particularly, Dr. Sarah Dauncey, Lucy Devine, and Mary Brown. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jane. So I'm going to hand over to Kudzia now.
I'm going to mute myself. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk about flexible working. And Tulip, I'm really happy to see you here as well. And we absolutely unequivocally backed your 10-minute rule change because we think if we are going to honestly and meaningfully represent what working people want, we have to take flexible working seriously. So I'm Kudzia. I am the head of equalities at the TUC, and I am incredibly proud to work with my colleagues Sue and Alice, who have been part of the Flex for All coalition, and we've published a report on what the state of the nation regarding flexible working is and what we believe true flexible working should look like and what our recommendations to government and to employers should be. What I say won't surprise you. Jane said most of it already, as did Tulip before her, and that's because we're all agreed on what needs to be changed and what needs to be addressed. Furthermore, well, before that, I'm just going to start and be a little bit self-indulgent and talk about my own experiences of flexible working. And and the reason I think it's relevant is because it was only when I was removed from that situation and I was doing this work that I had the, oh my goodness, it's not just me. This is what is happening to women and people requiring flexible work up and down the country, and this is what it's doing to us. So I was a teacher. I was a teacher for 20 years, and for a big chunk of that, I was a head teacher. And then I had a son. And when my son was born, I realised that there was this other thing in my life that I really ought to give some time to. So I needed some flexibility at work. And going to my employer and talking about flexibility, and by the way, I was the head of the school, and talking about the flexibility I would need to support my school and move forward, was one of those comical tumbleweed moments. There was silence. There was almost a how dare you ask for flexibility, and and hard choices had to be made. And the reality is I struggled along and missed the first year of my son's life, And I talk about that because I think it's really important to highlight the impact of what the lack of flexibility is in real terms. It's quite amusing because when the pandemic hit and we had to work differently, I realized that there was this child living in my house who was really interesting and exciting, but it gave me the opportunity to think about what the impact of flexible working is. Anyway, Rosie, I'm going to go back on script now, you'll be pleased to know, and focus. So I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of flexible working beyond my anecdotal evidence. And we know that genuine flexible working has significant benefits for working people. There's no two ways about that. That is, every bit of research. There is nothing that will tell you actually flexible working is bad economics or downgrades productivity. That's not true. It is good for business and it is good for working people. That's the reality of this. It's invaluable in helping people achieve a balance between work and home. And it is really clearly associated with improved well-being. And I'm going to reference a few things and like improved well-being. And if anybody wants further evidence or what our research is on that, all of this is on our website. We did some recent ONS analysis, and that showed us that workers feel the main advantages of home working are an improved work-life balance and a reduction in time taken to complete work. Now, I'm talking about home working there, but later on I'm going to talk about flexible working more broadly, because let's be clear, home working is not a synonym for flexible working and vice versa. It is one of the tools in the toolkit of flexible working, and what we've kind of got wrapped up in is this flexible working is home working, and we can't allow home working to happen because of X, Y, and Z. And I think I was really, heartened to hear Tulip and Jane both talk about, and Rose, about how flexible working actually is about so much more than that. And job security is a really key part of flexibility. So as well as offering benefits to people across the workforce, making flexible working available in all but the most exceptional of circumstances, I think, and this is why we're here today, is a really important catalyst for promoting greater gender equality. There's extensive research, including our own, that's shown many of the underlying causes of the gender pay gap are connected to a lack of quality jobs to offer flexible work. And that's due to the unequal division of unpaid care, because women often end up having to apply for part-time. And, and the statistic is that 75% of part-time jobs are taken up by women. And that leads to the gender inequality, which is evidenced in gender pay gap year on year. Making flexible working the default would help to address some of these barriers. And, we recently had the government's response to the flexible working consultation, and our view very clearly is a right to request is a right to be denied. It has to go much further than just a right to request flexible working. And I'll talk a little bit later about what our recommendations around that are. But often, part-time working and those types of flexible working is falsely positioned as a choice, and I use those inverted commas directly, women make to care for their children, because the lack of good flexible working opportunities force women into accepting often poorly paid part-time jobs, exacerbating the gender pay gap. And part-time workers are paid less than full-time workers with equivalent qualifications and have fewer career pay and progression opportunities compared to full-time workers. And again, there are reams and reams and reams of data that evidence this. Making flexible work the default would help address some of those barriers, and particularly to barriers to disabled workers, barriers to those experiencing domestic abuse, carers, and women experiencing the menopause phase in the workplace. Flexible work, for example, and these are the other options, things like phased retirement, would also help older workers to stay in the workforce for longer. And remote working has the potential to help address geographic inequality by opening up higher paid office jobs based disproportionately located in London and the South East to workers across the country. We did some research at the beginning of the pandemic, and starkly it told us that there were some regions where the rate of home working was 0% because those jobs just didn't exist. And, and it's not one-sided. It's not about benefits for workers. It's also about benefits for employers. And they include, a boost to productivity, increase staff retention, and improve recruitment. The Government Equalities Office did some research recently, and they found that jobs advertised flexibly attracted 30% more applications than those that did not. The Royal College of Midwife research also shows that 76% of midwives who left the job might return if there were more opportunities to work flexibly. And the NAHT, which is the Head Teachers Association, they reported to us that a lack of work and home life balance is a significant reason that teachers are reluctant to apply for senior leadership roles. And those are really good examples, because job design has to look differently. People say, how can you work flexibly? If I'm meant to be in a delivery suite helping babies be delivered, how can I work flexibly if I am in school and I'm meant to be in a group full of children? And that's why flexibility has to look different ways for different roles, and it has to be advertised as such. People have to know what opportunities exist out there, what job designs look like, and what flexibility is available in that context, because if nothing else, it gives people the choice rather than getting into roles and being stuck there. So some of our recommendations in this space are, we need to make sure that we avoid a class divide. We have to strengthen all workers' rights to access genuine flexible working, including things like predictable hours. So we need, some of the nuts and bolts around that, a legal duty on employers to consider which flexible working arrangements are available in role and publish them at the job advert phase. So many jobs are advertised saying things like, flexible working options considered. And we don't think that's a strong enough commitment from employers to demonstrate what that kind of flexibility looks like. Apologies, my office thinks I've disappeared. As long as you can still see me, it's fine. We also think that post holders should have a day one right to take up flexible working arrangements, that there shouldn't be a period of time that lapses. There shouldn't be this right to earn it, which I think embeds really negative workplace culture. And then if an employer does not think that flexible working arrangements are possible, then I think the onus should be on employers to set out why flexible working isn't possible and what exceptional circumstances justify that decision. Because currently, all the pressure is on employees, and employers still have this right to say, we can't accommodate you. And it's almost like a smoke and mirrors situation at times, trying to work out why that is. And we need more transparency in that process. We also need to act to eliminate one-sided false flexibility that is driven by employers through abolishing 0-hour contract. I can't stress enough how dangerous it has been for employers to say they are offering flexibility by saying 0 hours contracts and casualisation are the key to that, because that is a real dangerous route straight into poverty and job insecurity. And we really need the government to address those issues if they are serious about flexible working. And when the employment bill comes, I will have all my fingers crossed to hope some of these issues are addressed in that. We also think that some of the practicalities around that are giving workers the rights to a contract that reflects their regular hours, giving them notice so that they can plan shifts, and compensation where shifts are cancelled, because currently those things are not happening. So when I mentioned earlier about avoiding a class divide, there are people in jobs that are heavily casualised, people in 0 hours contract jobs, to whom flexibility has been nothing but negative, because what it has meant is they've had jobs cancelled at zero notice, they've had shifts dropped on them that they just can't get to, and where neither of those things exist, pay has been removed, and that is not what flexible working is. We also think that serious steps have to be taken to ensure that flexible working flexible workers don't experience worse terms and conditions or negative impacts on their health and well-being through giving the unions greater access to workplace rights, including home workers, strengthening collective bargaining, because we know the best way to ensure flexibility for workers is through collective action. Jane talked about designing it and working out what people want. We represent 5.8 million working people, and we believe that for real flexibility to take place, unions have to be at the table having that conversation with employers. And I'm just going to really mention, we have to really we have to get a grip on the use of AI and how we actually support autonomy and don't turn it into a surveillance culture for staff that are working remotely, and the health and safety of staff wherever they are. And also, last thing I'm going to say, Rosie, is we have to invite employers to come and talk to unions and say, we want to be flexible. How do we do it? And to design that together.
Thank you so much. And you weren't going off at the beginning. It was actually perfect. And I think it's a cause of great frustration to many of us that many women-dominated sectors, such as teaching, are often the worst places for flexibility and for gender pay gaps. So, your story, shed light on that. So thank you so much. So we're now going to take questions from the audience, and I've put them to the whole panel, and I've got a few here. So I'm just taking the first one from the chat that I've got here. So we've got from Diane Horsley: how damaging have high-profile CEOs who've been vocally negative about home working and flexible working been? Any views from our panel? Jane, Kutsia, Rose?
Thanks, Rosie. I think we have to take those with a pinch of salt, because for as many high-profile CEOs and chief execs who sit in their multi-million pound mansions or, offshore accounts, talking about the, what was it that people that work remotely should have, should be paid less and they're not as productive and it's an excuse for being lazy. There is an equal amount of good quality engagement happening with employers and their staff. There are some really big employers like Nationwide who took the decision to go completely flexible post-pandemic because they knew that really that the pandemic taught us a valuable lesson about how people work, and we can't go back to the old ways of working. So to answer the question, how damaging was it? I don't think it was. I think there are coalitions and organizations working together which represent not just employers and employees, but also the public more broadly. And we are working together to provide a solid evidence base about why flexible working is the correct solution, why it's good for productivity, why it's good for recruitment retention, rather than a few high profile egotistical CEOs.
Thank you, Kutsia. Jane?
I obviously agree with Kutsia. The only thing that I would counter that with is that for us, one of the things that we've established is that culture is really important and within an organization. And if flexible working is going to work throughout the organization, it's really helpful if it's led from the top. But obviously also to support what Kutsia said is we know from our employer members that many of them are embedding flexibility and ensuring that that works throughout the organization, irrespective of whether people are office-based and therefore can work in different ways and possibly work from home, or whether there are other forms of flexibility that are available for roles.
Thank you. Rose, have you got anything?
Yeah, just to come in on the perspective from our research on this kind of thing, a lot of our participants that we spoke to did speak about their managers and their CEOs and the types of comments that they made around parents' responsibilities and around flexible working. So I gave that one example of a manager being really unsupportive to a father that needed to pick up his kids and sort of saying like really quite almost like discriminatory and damaging things like, can't your wife pick up the kids from school, things like that, which really sends, the kind of wrong message to employees. And that particular father was actually quite frightened to ask for anything that he felt would be supportive for him and his family's well-being. So it really creates an atmosphere around what's okay to ask for and what's okay to speak about. And this kind of gatekeeping, which I think can be really damaging.
And Rose, we were going to return to the issue of the diversity of your sample, but I understand that you've covered that in the chat. And although it was a diverse sample, because it's a small qualitative research, it's not really possible to interact and say whether women from ethnic minority backgrounds particularly had a different experience, for example. But there is a page on the report that describes exactly the different backgrounds of the participants to the research.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So absolutely, we aim for diversity in the recruitment of the participants. But, you know, bearing in mind, this is a really small sample. So, and we're also not claiming at all that what we're saying is representative of the views of all parents in the UK. Absolutely not. What we're aiming for was a real in-depth understanding of the kinds of views and attitudes and kind of emotions that individuals have around these topics, and to really explore that in depth. So it's not a claim that it's representative at all. And as I said, it is a mixed methods project. So we have the quantitative research as well, which talks about more kind of on a national level, this is what's happening. But the aim with this part of the research was really the depth. And as Rosie said, there is a table in the report which has all of the characteristics of the sample. So you can see the diversity that we did achieve in terms of people's ages, regions where they lived, and jobs and ethnicity and things like that. If you're interested, it's on page 39.
Thank you, Rose. So the next question I'm bringing to everyone is from Monica Hockenall, and she said there's a real issue with parents, especially mothers, requesting to go part-time because they need flexibility, and then still doing all the work on less pay, and then on one day having a smaller pension. Certainly why I've never worked part-time is I thought as an academic I'd end up working full-time for part-time pay. Monica's question is, any ideas on how to prevent this? Any thoughts from the panel?
Absolutely. So for us, this is all about good quality job design, and that's where it's got to start from. And that is the thing that makes flexible working possible and makes the jobs human sized so that you can do the job in the hours that are allocated to it. And of course, part of that is to focus on outcomes as opposed to, are you sitting at your desk every 5 minutes, for every minute of the day, or are you being monitored every minute of the day, neither of which we think are a good thing. Where it doesn't help, of course, where that answer doesn't help, of course, is where people are still expected to produce the same results for half the amount of wages. One of the interesting things that we've noticed is that people who work flexibly before they have children tend to continue to work flexibly after they've had children, but work flexibly full time. So for us, it's one of those really tricky things. We would try to focus more on, for example, job shares, which mean that the whole job can get done, but it's shared across two people. But yes, it does also then have significant impact on pension, and the moments that matter that was done by Jane Portis with working with large insurers is a very horrible look at the fact that most women will retire with a pension pot that is on average 1/5 the size of the average man's. Wow. Which is horrifying.
That is horrifying. Kudsia, did you want to respond to this point?
I think Jane's absolutely right. It's in the job design. I think if we want true, meaningful flexibility, then there is a role for people to sit down and have a conversation about expectation, about delivery, about outcomes, about career development. And I think jobs have to be looked at in the whole rather than the focus being on, the drive to complete tasks, which is what many jobs have been and have been over time, and really look at outcomes and really go to people-focused roles. And I think there has to be an acknowledgement, I think, both from government in how they legislate, but employers in how they implement, the onus to ask on how to do it, because we're facing a situation we've never faced before, and what we have to do is work together to design and develop what that looks like. But alongside that, we have to take things like the gender pay gap and and hopefully ethnicity pay gap monitoring to see how we can use flexible working, true flexible working, and jobs that are designed flexibly to address those issues.
Thank you, Kudzia. And I've had a question about for Rose. Is there anything in the research that surprised you?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it actually isn't that surprising for anyone who kind of knows anything about this area. But having said that, I think, something that we really got from the qualitative method that we used was the emotion that there is around this topic, and in particular the anger that there is, especially from mothers, around the trade-offs side of things, and all of the things that they're giving up, really, just to ensure that they can kind of meet the responsibilities that they have. And just the sense of like real injustice. I didn't really have anyone say to me that they were happy with having given up, pay or their career. They were all genuinely sad and angry that they'd had to do that. And then by contrast, you had the dads being like, I've done this for the family and I'm really happy that I've done this, and I've gladly made these sacrifices for my family, and it's something they felt really positively about. So I think that contrast really struck me a lot, and I guess it's not necessarily surprising, but I think it's just the visceral emotion around it.
Thank you. And I've got a question for you, Jane. Many of the parents in the report talked about the importance of having control over their work. What do you think employers need to do differently to give parents a greater level of control over their working lives?
Yeah, so I'm afraid for us, this comes back again to job design and being outcomes-based, looking at work from an outcomes perspective, and trust. Flexibility, working flexibly, where you are trusted to deliver what you and your employer have agreed that role needs to deliver, is absolutely the key to successful flexible working. And we know that where parents aren't trusted to deliver, the engagement they have, and I think this is true for everybody who works, if you're not trusted in terms of the work that you're delivering, your engagement with that work will suffer, your engagement with your employer will suffer. So for us, it comes back to good quality job design, being treated as an adult, and looking at the outcomes of the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And Kudzia, I'm looking for a bit of optimism. Have you got any examples of employers who've done things to really improve things for working parents?
I mentioned earlier the approach Nationwide were taking, which was very much along the lines of, let's have an honest conversation around what flexibility looks like, because what have we learned from the pandemic? And the pandemic has shown us that productivity didn't dip, and it didn't dip even though people were working remotely, people were working different hours, people were prioritizing their jobs in a way that fit around their the other elements of their life. And I think employers sitting down with unions and to write up what the lessons from that were, and then to turn that into policy, was a really good example of what's being done well. But also within our own movement, there are many unions that are going more to task-based activities and task-based roles, so it's not about specifying how people work, but it's just making sure that that focus on the work that's being done, the support that's needed to do that job, and what are we learning and how are we working differently with each other is really important. And also, I think even though we've had the government announcing the new proposals to deliver on the promise to make flexible working a default, and them not going as far enough as we need them to go, because I think they lacked the teeth that really would have embedded flexible working. They in themselves do show some of the shoots of what we need around a change to culture, a change to attitude. People can't be put off of asking for flexible working, and attitudes have to change. And I was really interested in listening to what Rose was just saying about what the research told us about why people don't ask, and what the fear is, and what the gendered approach is to asking. And the three things that we are seeing that are changing in the workplace that are impacting the flexible working experiences are the steps that are being taken to address outdated attitudes, because that is one of the big barriers particularly for women, but people more broadly wanting to work flexibly. Steps being taken to address discrimination, because most people that are working flexibly said they have faced discrimination and disadvantage. So seeing that taken in hand is really addressing it, and it's showing that it's being taken seriously. And also, one of the things we are seeing, and I haven't got a specific example, Rosie, but it's something I'm seeing more and more of, is job interviews and job adverts beginning to demonstrate that openness towards flexible working. And for me, I think that is the biggest change we're seeing, where people are saying, we are a flexible working employer. This is what flexible working at our organisation looks like, and we would like to talk to you about that interview. Therefore, the onus is not on people making the request to really put themselves out there and face those attitudes and face that negative discrimination. So the more and more we see of that, the better it is.
Thank you. You have given me a bit of optimism. And I'm taking us to a question from Emily Hutchinson, which relates to your point about outdated attitudes. And she says, what guidance would you give to organisations who've got excellent policies on paper, but actually there's inconsistency across the business? For example, some line managers live and breathe flexibility, while others really don't. So it's this perennial question about managers' discretion, and what do we do to change those attitudes? Jane, have you got a response to that?
Absolutely. At employer level, we would always say that you need to train your line managers. Line managers come in for a lot of flack because they're expected to deliver on behalf of their employers. But if they're not given the tools to enable them to change and to look at things differently, it's terribly difficult for them to do that. So we would absolutely recommend that line managers get trained. That's absolutely critical. And it's the culture within the organisation. As we were talking about earlier, it's seeing it becoming embedded, seeing it becoming normalised, having particularly men telling people that they're off to pick up their children, for example, if that's part of it, or saying that they're not working on Wednesday because that's their day for, I don't know, going to university or some other training that they're doing. So line manager training, hugely important.
Thank you so much. And Kutsia, have you got any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, I would agree with Jane 1,000,000%, because policies and procedures are only as good as the people implementing them, and their ability to implement them is only as good as the training they've received. And anyone that's been a line manager will tell you that they are not taught to manage alongside the other bits of their job they have to deliver on. So we think when we say about having job design and a commitment to flexibility, it does include things like training and development for those that line manage people, and also that culture of flexibility has to live in your organization, and it has to be normalized, and it has to be shared, and it has to be, I think, celebrated. And I think one of the things I would say is, if you have got policies and procedures that don't work, is go to, the structures that exist in your workplace and have the conversation, because for all my cynicism, employers don't want policies and procedures that don't work. So if they don't work, I think it's about starting that dialogue about what needs to change. And if it's something a little bit more unwritten and unsaid than that, I would always advocate for going to your union and having that conversation there.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm just looking at some more questions from the audience here.
Can I just come in on that last one? Sorry. Yeah, just about the line manager question. So it can also be the case that we sort of discovered through the research that, if the organisation doesn't have good policies and procedures, maybe individual line managers are really great and really understanding and really, really helpful to employees in terms of being flexible, etc. And while this is great, it can be something that keeps people trapped in certain positions, because they feel that if they moved and had a different manager, that manager wouldn't be as accommodating, and they're really fearful of losing that. And so that sort of really, from a different angle, underscores the point about needing it to be a shared thing across the organisation. So it's not just about being dependent on your relationship with one person to be able to work in the way that you want, because that breeds a level of kind of insecurity as well.
Thanks, Rose. And then we've got a question from Jane Morgan. She says 61% of people are employed in SMEs. What actions can we take to encourage the majority of private sector employers in these organisations to adopt flexible working patterns? Any views from our panel?
Yeah, for us, it would be all about productivity and employee engagement. We did some research back in 2000 looking at micro organisations where the relationship between an employer, if you're under 10 employees, the relationship between the employer and the employees will be different because they know and trust one another. So if that flexibility is required and offered, it's a much easier relationship. So with SMEs, they get to a point where it becomes very difficult to do that, but it's employee engagement and productivity that are the drivers of that. And the only way that people will turn up to do their best possible work for you as an employer is if you as an employer are turning up and doing the best possible job you can do to support your employees.
Thank you. Kudzi, did you want to add anything to that?
I think productivity is, the biggest driver that there is, but also if we look at the types of people that are concentrated in their roles, they are people concentrated in those roles are people that would benefit massively from flexibility, and SMEs, etc., aren't immune to recruitment and retention crises, aren't immune to the workforce issues that we're seeing at the minute. So I think using it as a big tool to incentivize is really, really important. Let's be honest, the world of work has changed. Nobody is going to ever look at the way we used to work and think, God, that was a good way of working, let's go back to that. And it's really about how far ahead of the curve you can get to make yourself an employer of choice.
Thank you. I'm going to just have one more question now, and it's directed at Rose, but I actually think it applies to all of us, and Tulip's talked about this in her response. So it's from Arlene Holmes Henderson, and she says the report has identified recommendations for policymakers. What are the next steps? How will you engage policymakers in conversation? And I wondered whether all of the panel might sort of talk to us about what can we do to actually take concrete steps to bring about change now. Jane, do you want to pop in?
Yeah. Yes, for us, I guess it's a moving picture that every improvement leads to another improvement and another improvement. And we know from this pandemic that in many ways, anybody who was a knowledge worker who had an office-based role was able to work from home. And that brought up significant challenges with children, particularly when people were trying to homeschool. I don't think that's a thing really. But for us, it's about what is the next step, constantly looking for that next thing that you can do. And particularly talking about how flexible working is a benefit, not just for working parents and carers, but for so many people at different points in their lives. So if you are starting work, you may want to be doing some training on the side or developing further education for yourself. And then towards the end of your working life, you may again want to be working fewer hours, but still working. So the more flexibility is embedded through all roles, the easier that culture will be to embed.
Absolutely. And Rose, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think for us from the research point of view, I think so we're obviously continuing this project, and we've got the quantitative side, which is looking at on a more kind of national level, looking at differences in job quality across all of the different components that I spoke about earlier, and comparing that between mothers and fathers and parents and non-parents, and trying to really highlight, you know, what the kind of advantages and disadvantages are in terms of job quality for different people, and really keeping that question of job quality on the agenda alongside the flexibility. Obviously, it's all so interlinked, and you can't talk about one without the other. But we think it's really important for us to keep on underscoring, you know, where those differences are, to try and, you know, keep job quality high on the agenda alongside the current agenda of kind of employment and jobs and getting people into work. Yeah, so we're going to be contributing to the flexible working consultation as well, that's coming up with some of the evidence that we've gathered for this research, and hoping that makes a difference. Yeah.
Thanks, Rose. And Kutsia?
Like Rose, in the background that you can't see, I've actually got our consultation response to sign off on. So, you know, we're all collectively working in the same space to make sure that those views get put across strongly. But I don't think anybody needs to wait for government to pass legislation. There is a role for organisations like ourselves to share that information that we hold, the research that we have, to talk about it widely and loudly. But for us as unions, particularly, to work with employers to develop flexible working. You know, I got told off, I used to call it flexible working by stealth. You know, if everyone's doing it, it's hard to legislate against it then. And I really think that's what we should do. And, you know, going back to your earlier question, Rosie, about good examples, you know, the NHS, I've got a massive case of flexible working. Historic Scotland, UK Power Network, Centrica, all have got, they're big employers with really big pushes on flexible working. So I think we create coalitions at that level as well. And we make sure that we tie it to pay, to progression, to training and development, to recruitment, retention, to discipline and guidance and other policies, that it's embedded as part of the ways that companies and businesses and organizations operate, and not seen as a bolt-on. And I think when we get that working relationship and that level of coalition together, we can continue to develop the more broader relationships. We're currently working with both BAYS and with the CBI around this space, as I'm sure, you know, many of our partners are, because we know that it's a big change. It's a big change to how we work. It's the most significant change in the world of work that exists in most people's lifetimes. So it does need that 360 approach, but doesn't mean we have to wait for things to happen before we can start implementing it.
Thank you. And I have to say, one of the things for me about this report and this conversation is how important it's been hearing individuals' voices about their experiences. Because when we see the mass survey data and the numbers, it doesn't make it personal. And, you know, employers can tell us they've got great policies, but when you hear individuals saying what their experience has been like, it really brings it to life. And I think one of the things that we really care about at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is that this opportunity for greater flexibility is, we make the best of it, but it also applies to everybody. And this isn't just something that office workers can take advantage of. That we actually think much more about our key workers, about our caring sector. As you said, Kutsia, how do we build predictability and flexibility into work from the beginning? Because frankly, if women had been employed in the numbers that we are now in the past, that's the way it would have been. We need to gender in a fairer way our whole workplace. So we're so grateful for your contributions and for your work on the report. And thank you so much to the audience as well for joining us today. Lots of work to do, but progress to be made. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.